Welcome back to my channel for another Leica episode, and this is a video a lot of people have asked for. It's a one-on-one comparison between the brand new Summilux-M 35mm and the already established but still kind of new Apo-Summicron-M 35mm. And between these two lenses there are differences I can see, differences I can feel, and differences I find in the specifications of the two lenses. And we'll look into all of that in the course of the video. Of course, I will also shoot both lenses side by side, shooting the same scene and comparing the images. Let's kick this off. What I also have here in front of me on the table is my Leica M11, and I used this camera to shoot both lenses in order to compare them. And I was using the rangefinder but also the electronic viewfinder, because if you open the aperture widest, for instance on a close-up distance, the depth of field becomes very shallow. So I wanted to be sure I do justice to both of these lenses and shooting them in the best possible way. When comparing the two lenses, let's start with differences we can see immediately. And the first difference is obvious. We have on the new Summilux-M a lens cap which is clipped on and made out of plastic. And on the Apo-Summicron-M we have a lens cap which is built out of metal. It's a full metal construction here, and it slides over the lens hood here. So that is a difference, of course, we can note here. And then the second one is the lens hood itself. So here the lens hood is a screw-on lens hood. So it's screwed on and you can screw it off, of course. And it's also a full metal construction. And here we have a lens hood which is built into the lens. And both are designs we have seen on various other lenses from the Leica M lens lineup. So here you can screw it out, and then if you don't shoot any longer, you can screw it in and clip the lens cap on. And here you have screwed it on from scratch, and then if you don't any longer shoot, you just slide it over the lens hood. Let's, for a fair comparison, remove the lens cap, and let's keep the lens hood here screwed in and not screwed out. And on the Apo-Summicron, let's remove the lens cap and let's screw off the lens hood here. And then if we put them side by side, both of these lenses have, from my side here, a protector mounted, because I want to protect this expensive glass. But if you put them side by side, you see immediately that the new Summilux-M is a bigger lens in terms of diameter, in terms of the length of the lens. And that is very typical for a lens which can be opened wider. And here we have a widest open aperture of f1.4. And here on the Apo-Summicron, we have a widest open aperture of f2.0. So in terms of dimensions, the Summilux-M brings a bit more volume to the table than what we have on the Apo-Summicron, which is also reflected in the weight of the two lenses, which I'm going to show in a moment in the specification sheets of the two lenses. Summarizing, the differences we can see immediately concern the lens cap, the lens hood, and the dimension of the two lenses, and the Summilux-M here is more voluminous than what we have on the Apo-Summicron lens. Let's now look into differences we can feel when we operate these two Leica M lenses. And first of all, on the focusing ring, they are kind of at par. So here if I start from focusing at infinity and start to move the focus ring here, it's a very long travel way until it has a stop here and it clicks in a little bit at 0.7 meter. And that's where you leave the area where the rangefinder, so here the optical viewfinder, is capable of focusing the lens. And then from 0.7 on, if you come into the close-up region here, which is then below 0.7 meter, and on the Summilux-M goes all the way to 0.4 meter, you have to use the live view or the electronic viewfinder. And there is also a different color here on the scales. So up to 0.7 and between 0.7 and infinity, it's white in terms of color, and then it is gray if you come into the close-up range here. And on the Apo-Summicron it's the same. I can start at infinity, I have a very long travel way, and then at 0.7 it has a soft stop here. So you have kind of a click here, and then you get into the close-up range and you can start focusing in close-up distance. But here it ends at 0.3 meter instead of what we had here before. Let me go there and put them side by side. So here the hard stop is at 0.3 meter on the Apo-Summicron, and for the Summilux-M it's 0.4 meter. So we can get closer to the subject with the Apo-Summicron, then we can go with the Summilux-M 35mm. But in the way the focus ring feels when you operate it, it's buttery smooth, it's exactly the same on both lenses. Where I feel a difference is in the way I operate the aperture ring here. And let's start with the Apo-Summicron here. So you have the usual clicks here when it stops and half stops. Listen to that. So that's the usual mechanics we have on Leica M lenses, but here you have what is the normal case, and I've seen on many M lenses. You have a little bit of headroom once it clicked into the stop. Let's go to f5.6 for instance. I hope you can see this. There is a little bit of headroom. And it's also easier. The resistance is lower here if you rotate that aperture ring than what you have on the new Summilux-M. First of all, listen to the sound. It's very solid, but here there is no headroom. Once it clicked into an f-stop, there is absolutely no headroom. You have no way by fractions of a millimeter to move that until you give it a real push, and then it goes to the next half stop here. So that is something I've not seen before on Leica M lenses, and I should say I like it a lot. I mentioned it when I showed my unboxing of that lens. This is by far the best aperture ring I've ever had on a Leica M lenses in the way I can operate it. The resistance is significantly higher than what I have on the Apo-Summicron here. Here it's very easy, very soft to turn the aperture ring, and you might also accidentally turn it, whereas here you have significant resistance, and once it clicked in, there is no headroom, whereas here, if I go here also to f8, it has this tiny little headroom here, which you can see, maybe you can see it, which I don't have on the new Summilux. So in terms of the aperture ring, there is a difference what we can feel, and I prefer more the new mechanics Leica has built into the new Summilux than what I have on, all the other Leica M lenses, including this Apo-Summicron-M 35mm. We covered now the differences we can see, we covered differences we can feel, and now let's look into the specifications of the two lenses and let's discover a few more differences, and then let's go into a live shooting and let's compare sample images between these two lenses, because there are more differences to discover when we shoot these lenses with different shooting parameters. If you open the spec sheets on both lenses, you find what Leica calls the technical drawing. And that's what you see here on the left hand side, the Summilux-M, on the right hand side, the Apo-Summicron-M. But that doesn't give you, just from looking at the drawing, a lot of interesting information. But when you go further in the spec sheet, you find the floating lens elements. And this is acronymed as FLE, and is the reason why, for instance, if you go into the US, into the Leica store Miami, they call this new Summilux lens the FLE Mark II. And the floating lens elements help to, first of all, correct optical errors, but they also help for a better performance in close-up distance. And you see on the left-hand side the Summilux-M with floating elements, and then on the right-hand side the Apo-Summicron-M with floating elements, and these are also aspherical elements, so you can already guess that on the Apo-Summicron, if you go a bit closer by 0.3 meters as the minimum focusing distance compared to 0.4 meters on the Summilux, that you get a bit more macro type shooting capabilities on the Apo-Summicron lens than what you have on the Summilux-M. And then if you finally go into the detailed spec sheets, let's start from the top. The angle of view on the full frame sensor is for both lenses exactly the same, but the optical construction is more complex on the Apo-Summicron-M. So we have on the Summilux 9 lenses in 5 groups, and on the Apo-Summicron we have 10 lenses in 5 groups. But most importantly, in terms of aspherical surfaces, we have only 1 on the Summilux-M and 4 on the Apo-Summicron-M. And that is clearly something that makes a difference, and also explains the significantly higher price tag on the Summicron with $8,300 compared to $5,400 on the Summilux-M. And also on the close-up distance, you get a bit more on the Apo-Summicron with 30 centimeter compared to 40 centimeter on the Summilux-M. That's also reflected then in the largest scale or maximum magnification on the Apo-Summicron-M, where you can get as close as 30 centimeter. You have a maximum magnification of 1 divided by 5.6, which is very nice for close-up shots and macro type situations. And on the Summilux-M, you can also go for close-up shots, but your maximum magnification is only 1 divided by 8.9. On the aperture, we have one-on-one comparison here is exactly the same. So we have as smallest aperture on f16 and the number of aperture blades is now 11. And if you remember what I said in my intro video some weeks back on the new Summilux-M 35mm, before on the former version we had 9 aperture blades and now we have 11, which is exactly the same as what we have on the Apo-Summicron-M 35mm. When I put the lenses side by side previously in the video, I made the remark that the dimensions of the Summilux-M are larger, and that is also reflected in a larger filter thread of 46 versus 39 on the Apo-Summicron, and in addition also reflected in the weight. So on the Summilux-M we have a weight of 338 gram, and on the Apo-Summicron we have slightly less, 320 gram, but that's not moving the needle, of course. Since we have all that now, it's time to shoot these two lenses side by side with different shooting parameters and different shooting distance. And I will shoot these lenses at daylight with a normal shooting distance, with a close-up distance. I will also shoot them at nighttime, and then we compare the sample images and will reveal a few more differences between these two excellent Leica M lenses. Here's a selection of sample images, and let's start with a Japanese bonsai tree here. And since I cannot shoot the Apo-Summicron at f1.4, this is the Summilux only at 1.4. And if I crop in here by 100%, it's reasonably sharp, but it is also very dreamy and a bit soft. And that's the general character of a Leica Summilux lens. If you compare a Summilux with a Summicron lens, the Summilux by its character should be a bit more soft, a bit more dreamy, and the Summicron should be pinpoint sharp. And that's what we see here. If we look here into the details, we see a nice background bokeh and also foreground bokeh here, for instance, very nicely rendered. I was focusing at the tree here on the trunk, and if you see that here, it is sharp. There is a lot of detail, but it is at the same time dreamy, and is not what I would expect to see from a Summicron-M. By the way, all images I'm going to show in the next few minutes are out of camera digital negatives, so raw files which have not been edited at all in Lightroom. I didn't touch any slider here, and they are just as they are out of camera. And the second remark I need to make, when you see here for instance an f1.7 in the metadata, that's not the correct number, because there is only the 6-bit decoding of lenses when they are mounted to a Leica M camera body, and that only gives you an information about what type of lens is mounted to the Leica M11, but not the aperture parameters set on the lens. So the 1.7 here is just the best guess in the camera body, but is not the true aperture. This image was shot with an f1.4. A full comparison starts at an f2.0, and here is the image on the left hand side, the Summilux-M, on the right hand side the Apo-Summicron-M, both shot at an aperture of f2.0. Again, ignore the aperture shown here in the metadata. Exactly the same shooting parameters, 1/30 seconds, and base ISO of 64. And if I crop in here by 100% where the focus was sitting, then both images are very sharp. I would say subjectively that on the right hand side the Apo-Summicron is even a tiny little bit more sharp, but they are both reasonably sharp. And what you also see on the bokeh, let's go here to the front side, I think the Summilux is a bit more dreamy. And you also see this in the background blurriness here, and I think in general is a good image, but reveals already the tiny little differences between these two lenses. So we have a bit more sharpness, tiny little bit more sharp on the right hand side on the Apo-Summicron. Also the Summilux is reasonably sharp, and we have a bit more of a dreamy appearance on the Summilux side. And that's interesting, if you look at the image from a distance, I think the contrast is a bit stronger on the Apo-Summicron than what we have on the Summilux, which is again attributed to the different character of these two type of lenses. I've shot this tree with all different apertures between the two lenses, but this is the last one I want to show, and that's now an aperture of f2.8, so a little bit stopped down on both lenses, same shooting parameters, 1/15 seconds, ISO was base 64, and if I crop in here, then you will see that the level of sharpness is now exactly the same. There's no more difference between the Apo-Summicron and the Summilux. They reveal the same amount of details in these images, and the only difference we see is a little bit of the coloring. As I said, these images have not been edited or post-processed in Lightroom, and I think there is a difference in contrast here, and that's something you might want to expect if you compare a Summilux with a Summicron. But in general, sharpness is exactly the same, and that's why I don't want to show the other images where I stop further down, because that will only confirm what we already see here at an aperture of f2.8. Let's look into close-up distance, and since we have on the Apo-Summicron 0.3 meter and the Summilux-M 0.4 meter, I did shoot both lenses at 0.4 meter because that's the binding constraint. And with an aperture of f1.4, I can only shoot the Summilux-M, and that's what I did here. And the shooting parameters are 1/250 seconds, base ISO again 64, and you see how dreamy this is. The bokeh is just very pleasant on the Summilux-M, and if I crop in here by 100%, it's also reasonably sharp, but it's not tech sharp, which is the same as what we saw on the bonsai tree before. It is sharp, but not tech sharp. And there is this dreamy character of that lens, which I personally like a lot. Now, staying with that shooting distance of 0.4 meter, but stopping the Summilux down to f2.0, it becomes comparable with the Apo-Summicron. And if we look at that image here and crop in by 100%, they are both very sharp. And I was actually surprised to see the level of sharpness in this way coming from a Summilux lens, because that's not what I'm used to from former Summilux lenses. And if you look at that a little bit, you see again there is a bit more contrast on the Apo-Summicron, maybe a tiny little bit more being tech sharp, but the Summilux is absolutely sharp enough. And I think Leica did a great job here, giving us a Summilux with that dreamy look, but at the same time almost matching the sharpness of a Summicron lens. So that looks really nice. If you look at the background bokeh here, with the same open aperture of f2.0, you see how much more dreamy the Summilux is. And if you have actually a favor for this type of appearance, then the Summilux clearly is a dream lens, because it gives you that dreamy appearance of images in a very soft looking way. Look at that. You clearly see the difference here in the background bokeh between the Summilux on the left hand side and the Apo-Summicron on the right hand side. In the same way as what we saw on the bonsai tree before, if I stop down further to f2.8, these lenses become almost indistinguishable, and that is a very interesting observation here. So let's crop in by 100%, let's look at that, and both lenses are now tech sharp. So if you stop down the dreamy Summilux to an f2.8, you get the same sharpness as what you have on the Apo-Summicron-M. And also the difference in contrast is no longer eye-catching here. They look almost the same, and the same appears to the background bokeh. If you look at that, this is now almost identical. There is no difference which I can see with my naked eyes here if I stare on my MacBook screen, and these lenses become absolutely comparable and absolutely the same. And that's interesting, because if you're looking into the advantage you might have in low light to get one more stop wider open aperture like f1.4 compared to f2.0, but if you stop down both lenses to f2.8, they become indistinguishable. And if you also look into the difference in the price tag, then the new Summilux-M becomes a very interesting value proposition, of course. Let's now look into true night photography. And I was invited to a friend outside of Zurich, and they have a nice terrace, so I used the opportunity. And that's, by the way, the shortcoming if you invite me. I always have a camera with me and want to do a shooting, and I did shoot both lenses from the terrace. And let's again look into the Summilux first with the widest open aperture f1.4. And if we look here over Lake Zurich, we actually see nicely that the sharpness of the lens, by the way, it's loading here in Lightroom, let's wait for a moment to actually fully render the image, is quite nice. It is a bit soft, and it was a hazy day like we always have here in fall around Lake Zurich, but it looks reasonably well. Clearly in the foreground it's a bit fuzzy because I was shooting this lens widest open, but then at infinity it's reasonably sharp and it looks quite nice. And then of course, if I stop down the Summilux to f2.0, I can compare it again with the Apo-Summicron, and here these images look almost exactly the same. Let's crop in by 100% here. Let's have a look here, and the level of detail is, at least in my opinion here, exactly the same on both lenses. There is no difference here. If you look into that, hazy day for both lenses, some light trails here, and the houses in the background look very, very sharp. It looks good at f2.0. Also here, if we look into that, and there is no difference recognizable for me in these two images. And that's again an interesting data point aligned with what I said before. When we stop down the Summilux a little bit, it becomes very quickly comparable with the Apo-Summicron-M. Now for this type of night photography, I would typically go for an aperture of f8. And here is the image on both lenses for f8 with a 200-second exposure and, with an ISO of 64. Again, ignore the aperture here, it was not f16, it was an f8. And now these images are exactly the same, and they also reveal the same level of detail. Look at that here. Distinguish these two lenses because they are both tech sharp. You get so much detail in these images, and I don't think there is any difference recognizable here. If you look at that, it's sharp corner to corner. Also in the foreground here, very nice what we see. And I think this again shows that these two lenses, if you stop them down, they become indistinguishable. And that concludes actually the sample images I wanted to show. Here, by the way, I need to clean my sensor. You see here, there's a sensor spot here. That's something I need to do before the next shooting, but no difference recognizable in these images. Both are tech sharp and reveal the same level of detail and also the same contrast. There is no difference here. I hope you liked that comparison between the brand new Summilux-M 35mm and the still kind of fresh and new Apo-Summicron-M 35mm. And these are both excellent lenses. The weight is almost the same. The look and feel is quite comparable, although we have differences in the design when it comes to the lens caps, to the lens hood and to the dimensions of the lens. And there is also a difference we can feel when we look into the aperturing, as I demonstrated previously in the video. In terms of image quality, they are both excellent. Here, of course, on the Summilux-M, you have a bit more headroom and can open this wider to an f1.4. And if you are a low light shooter, and also, as you could see in the sample images, you prefer a slightly more dreamy bokeh, then this lens here is for you. If you want to have the best sharpness and crispness Leica can offer, then the Summicron-M 35mm is the lens to go for. But it's also a significantly more expensive lens, because here we pay about $8,300 and on the Summilux we pay $5,400. And if you ask me honestly, is that price difference still justified? I don't think so, because the sharpness of the new Summilux is almost the same as what you have on the Apo-Summicron. Although, as you saw in the sample images, the contrast on this lens definitely is better. If I know I'm going to shoot in a low light environment, that additional headroom on a wider aperture 1.4 compared to 2.0 might actually trigger my choice. But in general, the Apo-Summicron-M 35mm, based on sharpness, contrast, and in general, the way the images are coming out when you shoot this lens on the Leica M11, this is still one of my most favorite lenses in the Leica M lens lineup. But now the Summilux-M did actually compete and also conquered one of the top-notch rankings in my portfolio of Leica M lenses. If you liked that video, don't forget to drop me a thumbs up. Stay tuned on my channel. There's always more to come. Thanks for watching. Stay safe and healthy. And of course, peace out.